Right, now let's look at artillery combat. While the final calculation of disorder will look quite familiar, there are a lot of special mechanics to get to that point in terms of calling in fire and areas of effect and so on, which is why I'm doing a separate video for artillery. Artillery units are like any other unit in the game. They are battalions, regiments, whatever you like to call them, made up of 3 core companies. Usually that's it. It is in theory possible to have attachments to artillery regiments, but there'd be very little reason to do so in most cases. Most attachments have an effect during relatively short-range fire and would have no impact on artillery bombardment. So artillery units, artillery elements can be deployed in 2 different ways. They can be on board or off board, which means pretty much what it says. On board artillery are sitting on the playing table like any other element, any other unit. Off board are not. You do not deploy them on the battlefield. They are assumed to be set up just behind the line, just behind your baseline. Off-board artillery can come onto the board during the game. They can be towed on and deployed. They can't then withdraw again unless you're playing a multi-day game, when they can withdraw during the night. Another split is between the 2 types of fire that artillery can put down. You can use direct fire, which is firing over open sights at a target that the actual unit itself can see. Probably more common is indirect fire, where the battery is firing at a target which it cannot see itself, and it is directed onto the target by some other formation, some other unit. So let's look first at how artillery is allocated. You'll remember that time is split up into 2-hour day segments in this game, and within each day segment there are a variable number of turns from theoretically 0 up to 4. Now, your artillery units all have to be allocated at the start of each day segment, either to direct fire, in which case they're held to fire at targets of opportunity, or to bombardment, to indirect fire. Now, that decision, as I say, has to be made at the start of each day segment, and it will last for all the turns in that segment. I'll come back to direct fire at the end. It's much simpler. For indirect fire, each battery, each formation has to be directed onto a target by a formation on the table that can see that target. The target may be an enemy unit, or it may be a geographical point. But either way, the formation that can see it will direct the battery or batteries onto that target. This is automatic if they are both part of the same force group. If they're not, then you have to pass what's called an activation roll based on the quality of the general leading the force. In fact, that's taken, I guess, as a proxy for the quality of the force itself, its communications and so on. So if you're in one force group and you're trying to call in the fire of a battery in a different force group, then, as I say, you have to pass the activation test. Either way, once a battery has a target assigned to it, it will fire at that target for all the turns in the day segment. It can't move its fire, except in one special case of a forward observer, which I'll mention later. It will continue to fire at the same spot unless it's stopped. The formation that can see that spot can stop it, again having to pass an activation test if it is not part of the same force group. But otherwise, the battery will continue to bombard the same spot, and incidentally, if the original target was an enemy unit, and that unit moves away, then the battery will continue to pound the same location. It won't in any way track or follow the moving unit. Okay, so we've got the batteries. They've been allocated to indirect fire. They've had a target assigned to them. So now, how does the actual firing happen? Well, artillery fire happens early on in each turn, before movement and before what I might call the normal firing phase. The first thing that you do when the fire is incoming is to roll for deviation. So there's a simple deviation chart here. D6, if it's a 1 or a 2, then it lands exactly on the target spot. If it's 3, 4, 5 or 6, then it'll be over under left or right, and you'd roll a d6, and that's the number of inches or centimeters that it deviates. Now, the area of effect of bombardment depends on the caliber of the firing unit, and as you can see, as you would expect, the larger the gun, larger the caliber of the shell, the larger the beaten zone. The beaten zones are circles, and the caliber mostly affects the size of the beaten zone. It doesn't particularly affect the impact or the effectiveness of the fire. Now, that is determined by the quality of the battery that's firing. This is slightly misleading in the rules, but it's made clear in a clarification that's been issued. The artillery uses the infantry and indirect fire table, as with other non-armor piercing fire, and the fire die that is used is based on the quality of the battery firing. So if you've got elite gunners, they'll be rolling a d12 for the effectiveness of their fire. If you've got militia, they'll be rolling a d6, and everything in between. So you have incoming fire, you roll your deviation die, and everything that falls underneath the beaten zone, the circle of effect, any unit that is touched by that, friendly or enemy, will be attacked. And the attack is worked out in the usual way, with a fire die and a cover die. There are very few modifiers to the fire die. Most of the modifiers that we would normally use are based on attachments and firing at relatively short range. The rules aren't completely explicit about this. I do not use the -1 for the target having moved, because you're not, with indirect fire, trying to track, keep an aim on a moving target. And in fact, in many ways, if a unit is moving within an artillery barrage, it's probably more likely to be hit. So I don't use that modifier. The one I do use is -2 if the target is entrenched or an AFV formation. The cover die is based on the terrain for infantry or soft targets, and for AFVs it's based on their armour thickness. But there is one important point for artillery firing against armoured fighting vehicles, and this is that the cover die can be shifted, usually in favour of the tanks, based on the calibre of the artillery. And this is based on the idea that incoming HE fire is actually relatively harmless to armoured fighting vehicles, even quite small ones, unless it happens to land right on them. So against small-sized artillery, you can have a cover die that shifts up 3 types, and that means that even light armoured fighting vehicles, light tanks, will be rolling a d12 for their cover. The shift gets less as the shells get heavier, on the grounds that there is far more stuff flying around, and heavier stuff at that. And indeed, when you get to the very largest artillery, that's 320mm caliber, which really is talking about siege guns there, you actually have a shift in favour of the guns on the cover die. But all that is fairly rare and fairly simple. You just change the size of the cover die. And then you roll them in the normal way. You roll the artillery's fire die, the cover die for the target, and calculate the amount of disorder that has been caused. Okay, a couple of other things to say. I mentioned direct fire briefly, and that is undertaken by the battery as a unit on the field, seeing a target in range and firing at it. The beaten zone, the area of effect, is the same as it is for indirect fire, a circle based on the caliber. But there's no drift. The gunners put the shots directly on target, and they will very quickly adjust visually, so that the area of effect is centered on what they're shooting at. Other than that, the calculation of casualties, the calculation of disorder, is the same as it is for indirect fire. Now, I mentioned briefly forward observers. Forward observer is a special sort of attachment who can be attached to any of the formations in your army, and they can do anything that any ordinary formation can do in terms of calling in fire, but they have a couple of extra abilities. A forward observer can change the target of a battery during a day segment. In other words, if, for example, there's 4 turns in the day segment, the guns might fire on one target for a couple of those turns, and then maybe they've had sufficient effect, or perhaps the enemy unit's moved away. A forward observer can change the target of those guns to a different point. Again, as before, this is automatic if they are in the same force group. If the observer is trying to control a battery in a different force group, then they have to work the activation roll and pass it in order to make that change. The final thing that the forward observer can do, which is really, I guess, a special type of the previous one, is call in the fire of a battery which is being held in reserve. You may not allocate all your batteries to fire straight away, for no other reason as you don't want to run out of ammunition. But if a battery is in reserve, the forward observer can designate a target and get it firing at any time during the day segment, at any turn. So I think that pretty much covers the details of artillery. Just briefly, I guess one other point to mention, I mentioned running out of ammo, which is a risk that artillery runs like any other unit if they roll a 1 on their fire die. And if they do run out of ammo, they will need to be resupplied by a supply column or supply truck like any other units. One point I wanted to mention though is off-board artillery have the same issues. They can also run out of ammo, and if they do, the supply column has to move off the baseline off the board and spend 1 turn off the board for each artillery unit it's resupplying before they can start firing again. Okay, I think that covers it all, and I'll probably do a little demo with a couple of actual examples in a short while.